This house should already be mine. To me, you're already dead." The words, spoken by my own son, Matteo, echoed in the vast living room I had designed and built with my own 2 hands. They hung in the air, sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the warm afternoon sun streaming through the windows. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his eyes burning with a resentment that had clearly been simmering for years. Beside him, his wife Sophia wore a faint, triumphant smirk, her gaze unblinking as she watched the man who had provided for her every need be emotionally eviscerated. That single moment, that brutal declaration, wasn't just an insult. It was the final, undeniable confirmation of a truth I had been observing for more than a year. The cordiality was a facade, the family dinners a charade. For them, I was no longer a father. I was merely a stubborn obstacle between them and their inheritance. Before I continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Arturo Vargas, and at 72 years old, I've lived a life defined by precision, planning, and patience. As a retired civil engineer and a shrewd property investor, I spent 5 decades building structures meant to last for centuries, bridges that connected cities, buildings that shaped skylines, and a financial foundation designed to provide security for generations. I believed in solid groundwork, in understanding every angle before laying the first stone. This methodical approach brought me considerable success, allowing me to build not just a portfolio, but a life of comfort and dignity for my family. I always believed that the greatest project of my life was my family, and I poured into it the same dedication and resources I gave my most ambitious engineering feats, never imagining that its foundations were rotten from within. My son, Matteo, now 42, and his wife, Sophia, 39, had been living with me for the past 5 years. What began as a temporary solution to one of Matteo's many self-inflicted financial crises had slowly, insidiously become a permanent state of affairs. Matteo was a man blessed with ambition, but cursed with a lack of discipline and a profound sense of entitlement. I had funded at least 6 of his groundbreaking business ventures, from a failed artisanal coffee shop to an ill-fated app for rating park benches. Each time he would return, cap in hand, defeated but not humbled, and I, his father, would rescue him, believing that the next time he would surely succeed. Sophia, his wife, was the catalyst for his worst impulses, constantly inflating his ego and whispering venomous complaints about my old-fashioned ways and my refusal to pass the torch. Their life under my roof was one of complete and total dependency, a reality they conveniently ignored. They lived in a home they didn't pay for, drove cars purchased with my money, and enjoyed a lifestyle funded entirely by my pension and investment returns. I covered every expense, from their designer clothes to their extravagant weekend getaways, all while they spoke of me as if I were a warden, a gatekeeper to the life they truly deserved. They moved through my home not as grateful family members, but as impatient heirs, their conversations often ceasing abruptly the moment I entered a room. The air was thick with their unspoken desire for me to simply vanish, leaving behind the keys to the kingdom they felt was their birthright. A kingdom they had done absolutely nothing to build. This house, nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street, was more than just my largest asset. It was the culmination of my life's work and the sanctuary I had built for my late wife, Eleanor. Every beam, every tile, every pane of glass had been chosen by us. The grand oak tree in the backyard was planted the day Matteo was born. The reading nook by the bay window was where Elena spent her final peaceful days. To me, these walls held memories, laughter, and the lingering presence of the love of my life. But to Matteo and Sophia, it was simply a 5,000 square foot property in a desirable neighborhood, a high-value asset to be liquidated at the earliest opportunity. Their eyes would scan the rooms, not seeing a home, but a real estate listing, The final confrontation erupted during what had become a tense, routine afternoon coffee. The silence between us was heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of porcelain. I watched as Sophia ran her fingers over a Lalique crystal vase on the mantelpiece, a gift I had given Eleanor on our 30th anniversary. Her touch was not one of admiration for its delicate craftsmanship, but of appraisal, her eyes calculating its value with the cold precision of an auctioneer. The look on her face was a microcosm of their entire existence in my home, a constant, silent evaluation of my possessions, a mental inventory of their future wealth. It was a look that stripped every object of its sentimental value, reducing my life's treasures to mere price tags. As if on cue, Matteo began to speak, his voice filled with a false, breezy enthusiasm about his plans for the house. He spoke of modernizing the space, of knocking down the wall to the study where I kept my life's blueprints and memories. He wanted to replace Elena's beloved antique furniture with minimalist cold pieces he'd seen in a magazine. He talked about maximizing the property's resale value as if I were already a portrait on the wall, a distant memory instead of the man sitting right in front of him. He wasn't sharing a vision. He was outlining my erasure, detailing the methodical dismantling of my identity and my past, completely oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the pain his words inflicted. Throughout his monologue, I remained silent, my hands wrapped around my cooling coffee cup. My silence was not one of submission or weakness. It was the focused quiet of an engineer analyzing stress points, identifying the critical flaws in a structure. I listened to every word, observed every greedy glance from Sophia, and felt the palpable impatience radiating from my son. It was in that moment that the full, devastating picture came into focus. They did not see me as their father or benefactor. In their eyes, I was a stubborn old man clinging to life, a living, breathing delay to their gratification. I was a ghost haunting my own home, a sentinel guarding a treasure they believed was already theirs. The final straw, the catalyst for the explosion, was my refusal to finance his latest foolproof scheme, a $200,000 investment in a volatile cryptocurrency he couldn't even explain properly. I calmly outlined the risks, the lack of a coherent business plan, and the sheer recklessness of the idea. I spoke to him not as a condescending father, but as an experienced investor, presenting facts and logic. "Matteo," I said gently, "a solid foundation is everything. This has none." But he didn't hear reason. He only heard denial. He saw my prudence not as protection, but as a personal attack. Another instance of me holding him back, of me refusing to give him what he felt he was owed. Sophia, sensing his hesitation, seized the opportunity. She leaned in, her voice a venomous whisper in his ear, loud enough for me to hear. "He's just trying to control you, Matty. He's a senile old man who can't stand to see you succeed without him. It's our money he's holding on to." Her words were the spark to the gasoline. Matteo's face contorted. Years of perceived slights, of living in my shadow, of feeling like a failure, erupted in a volcanic rage. The thin veneer of civility he had maintained for years cracked and then disintegrated entirely, revealing the ugly, resentful child beneath the skin of the 42-year-old man. And so we returned to the beginning of this painful memory. After screaming those terrible words that I was already dead to him, he acted with a swiftness that was horrifying. He stormed to the entryway, snatched my keys from the hook where they had hung for 30 years, and disappeared into my bedroom. He returned a moment later with the small suitcase I kept packed for weekend trips to my cabin. With a grunt, he threw it out standing on my own lawn, looking at the door that had just been locked against me. I felt no surge of panic or despair. There was no hot rush of anger, no debilitating wave of grief. Instead, a profound and chilling calm settled over me. The kind of stillness that comes after a violent storm has passed. Matteo's brutal words and actions were not a new wound. They were merely the final clinical confirmation of a diagnosis I had made long ago. My heart had already broken slowly over the past year, piece by piece, with every whispered conversation I overheard, every valuable object that quietly disappeared. The click of the deadbolt was not the sound of my world ending. It was the starting pistol for a new, meticulously planned beginning. I didn't wander the streets aimlessly or desperately call friends for a place to stay. Such actions would have been born of surprise, and I was anything but surprised. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened an app. With a few taps, I summoned a luxury car service. When the sleek black sedan arrived minutes later, the driver respectfully held the door for me. I gave him the address, not of a dreary motel, but of the Sterling Residences, an exclusive apart hotel in the heart of the city. I'd leased a one-bedroom suite there a month prior, under a corporate name, as a key component of my contingency plan. This was not a retreat. It was a strategic relocation to my new command center. Inside, the sterile quiet of the hotel suite, with its panoramic views of a city I had helped build, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. This feeling inside me wasn't a thirst for vengeance. Revenge is a chaotic, emotional fire that consumes everything, including the person who lights it. What I was about to undertake was different. It was a course correction. It was the precise, methodical application of consequences, an engineering solution designed to address a catastrophic structural failure within my own family. My objective was not to destroy Matteo, but to systematically dismantle the false, entitled reality he had constructed around himself, forcing him to stand on the solid, unforgiving ground of his own choices for the very first time in his life. The next morning, at precisely 9:00 a.m., I made my first and only necessary call. I dialed the direct line of David Chen, my lawyer for over 30 years, a man whose mind was as sharp and unyielding as structural steel. My voice was even and steady, devoid of any emotional tremor. "David, it's Arturo," I said. "The final data point has been collected. We are green-lit for Phase 2. There was no need for lengthy explanations or panicked retellings. The entire strategy had been architected and war-gamed in his office weeks ago. This was not a cry for help. It was an activation command. Our subsequent meeting that afternoon was not a therapy session, but a project kickoff for the most personal and complex demolition of my career. At the core of my strategy, as I explained it again to David, was the masterstroke we had devised, the Vargas Family Legacy Trust. Over the preceding 6 months, we had worked quietly and diligently to legally transfer the ownership of my most significant assets into this impenetrable legal entity. The house, my entire stock portfolio, and 2 commercial properties I owned downtown no longer belonged to Arturo Vargas, the person. They belonged to the trust. And I, as the sole trustee and administrator, had absolute and solitary control. This single critical move meant that Matteo and Sofia were not just ungrateful children in their father's house. They were illegal occupants on property owned by a corporate entity, and they were about to be treated as such. My foresight had extended beyond legal structures. 3 months earlier, I had hired a discreet security firm, the kind that usually sweeps for bugs in corporate boardrooms, to perform a special installation at my home. Under the guise of a security upgrade, they fitted micro cameras into strategic, unnoticeable locations, the corner of a smoke detector in the living room, a tiny aperture in an air conditioning vent in my office, and even nestled within the intricate carvings of the wooden mantelpiece. These devices recorded crystal-clear audio and high-definition video, archiving everything to a secure cloud server. I now had an unblinking, unbiased witness to everything that was said and done within those walls. Concurrently, I had systematically firewalled my finances. I opened a new set of accounts at a competing bank and began a slow, methodical transfer of my liquid assets, careful to avoid raising any red flags. The joint account that Matteo occasionally used for emergencies was gradually drained until it held less than $100. His supplementary credit card, a symbol of his perpetual reliance on me, was cancelled, not with a confrontational phone call, but with a few silent clicks on a banking website. I was methodically cutting off the supply lines of money and resources that had fueled their parasitic lifestyle, ensuring that when their world began to shrink, it would be a complete and inescapable implosion. One of the most powerful tools in my arsenal was not a legal document, but a simple spreadsheet I had maintained with engineering precision for over a decade. Every loan I had given Matteo, every failed business venture I had bailed out, every luxury purchase made on my dime was meticulously recorded, complete with dates, amounts, and the flimsy justifications he had provided at the time. What he had always viewed as an endless fountain of fatherly generosity, I had catalogued as a debt. When tallied and compounded with a modest interest rate, the total came to an astonishing 850,432. This was no longer just a family drama. It was now a formal, documented financial liability that I fully intended to collect. The final piece of my defensive architecture involved rewriting my last will and testament. The old version, written when I still harbored illusions about my son's character, left him the bulk of my estate. The new will, drafted by David's sharpest estate lawyer and signed and witnessed 2 weeks ago, was a work of art. Upon my death, Matteo would not inherit a fortune. Instead, the trust was instructed to pay him a modest monthly stipend, barely enough for a small apartment and groceries. Even that small allowance was contingent on him proving he was gainfully employed and attending mandatory financial and psychological counseling, with his progress reviewed quarterly by a court-appointed administrator. His inheritance was no longer a golden parachute. It was a rigid, unforgiving rehabilitation program. With all the pieces in place, my next move was the most difficult. I did nothing. I let a full week pass in complete silence. I did not call them, I did not text, and I did not respond to the single perfunctory message Matteo sent asking if I was okay. I knew this silence would be their undoing. In their arrogance, they would not interpret my absence as a threat, but as the defeated retreat of a frail, broken old man. I gave them the time and space to become comfortable in their perceived victory, to let their guards down, and to reveal their true natures to my hidden cameras. I was setting the bait, confident that their greed would compel them to take it without a second thought. The wait proved more fruitful than I could have ever imagined. Each evening in David's office, we would review the day's recordings. It was a sickening but necessary ritual. We watched as they toasted their newfound freedom with my best bottle of scotch. We listened to Sophia's giddy phone call to a luxury real estate agent, arranging for a private valuation of the house for a quick, off-market sale. We heard them openly mock my supposed senility and stubbornness, laughing at how they had finally outsmarted me. Every word they spoke was another nail in their own coffin, and I was simply providing the hammer. The surveillance uncovered betrayals that cut deeper than mere financial greed. One evening, I overheard a hushed conversation between them. Sophia confessed to having pawned several pieces of my late wife's jewelry, pieces I had believed were simply lost over the years. She had sold my Elena's memories, her diamond earrings, her favorite pearl necklace, to fund a weekend trip to a spa resort. Matteo, to my horror, had not been ignorant of this. He had actively helped her concoct the stories to cover the thefts. This wasn't just about their future anymore. They had been actively stealing from my past, desecrating the memory of the woman I loved. The recordings also painted a damning portrait of Matteo as a man utterly devoid of character. We captured phone calls where he lied to old family friends, trying to secure loans by claiming he was now the head of the Vargas estate and was simply waiting for probate to clear. He was leveraging my reputation. After one full week, with an overwhelming body of evidence compiled, I authorized David to begin the offensive. The first move was subtle but effective. His office sent a legally binding cease and desist letter via courier to the realty firm the agent worked for. The letter coldly informed them that they were marketing a property, the legal ownership of which was held by the Vargas Legacy Trust, and that their clients, Mr. and Mrs. Vargas, had no authority to sell. It warned of severe legal repercussions, including tortious interference if they continued. Within an hour, the panicked agent called Sophia to tell her he was dropping them immediately. Simultaneously, the financial frost began to bite. Matteo took Sophia to a Michelin-starred restaurant to celebrate their impending wealth, and when the bill came, his credit card was declined. Flustered, he tried a debit card, only to have it rejected for insufficient funds. Their panicked, whispered argument at the table was, I imagined, the first tremor of the earthquake to come. The invisible walls of the comfortable world I had provided were beginning to close in, and they had no idea why. My strategy was not confined to legal and financial arenas. It extended to the social circles they so desperately wanted to inhabit. I made a series of quiet, deliberate phone calls to a few old and influential friends in the city's business community. I didn't need to slander my own son. I simply expressed my profound disappointment and concern over some of Matteo's recent, ethically questionable business decisions. I advised them as a friend to exercise extreme caution in any dealings with him. The doors that my name had once effortlessly opened for him began to swing shut one by one, locked from the inside by the very people he sought to impress. The final move of this phase was the most direct. A uniformed court officer arrived at the front door of my house and served Matteo and Sophia with a formal summons. The document was an imposing piece of legal correspondence, commanding their presence at the offices of Chen and Associates for a mandatory meeting regarding the illegal occupation of a property owned by the Vargas Legacy Trust. I knew they would read it with a mix of confusion and arrogance, likely assuming it was a desperate gambit from me to negotiate my return. They would walk into that meeting expecting a family argument. They would find themselves in a legal ambush. David's main conference room was meticulously prepared for the confrontation. It looked less like a lawyer's office and more like a war room. A large 80-inch screen dominated one wall. In the center of the vast mahogany table, two thick leather-bound dossiers were placed, their names embossed in gold on the cover. We even hired a certified court stenographer who sat discreetly in the corner to ensure every word spoken was captured in an official, legally admissible transcript. The message was clear. This was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. In the days leading up to the scheduled meeting, I felt a peculiar sense of calm, the same feeling I would experience before the controlled demolition of an unstable structure. All the calculations had been verified, all the explosive charges had been strategically placed at the weakest structural points, and all the necessary precautions were taken. All that was left was to press the detonation button and watch the building collapse precisely upon its own footprint, exactly as designed. The imminent collapse of their carefully constructed world was no longer a matter of emotion, but of physics. Further review of the audio recordings revealed the truly breathtaking scope of their avarice. They weren't just planning to sell the house. They had created a detailed inventory of every single valuable object within it. They had contacted auction houses to get appraisals for my art collection, my library of first edition books, even my classic 1968 Mercedes-Benz convertible. Their plan was a total and complete liquidation of my entire existence. A conversion of my life's work and memories into a pile of cash they could burn through on the shores of the Mediterranean. It is crucial to understand that my actions were not born from a place of lingering anger. The emotional wound of their betrayal was real, but it had already scarred over, leaving behind a hard, resolute purpose. I now operated with the detached precision of a surgeon excising a malignant tumor. The procedure itself is methodical, unemotional, and focused on a single objective: remove the sickness to save the patient. In this case, my own peace and dignity were the patient, and their parasitic presence was the disease that had to be cut away cleanly and completely. The last piece of evidence we catalogued was a recording of a phone call Matteo made to an old college friend, bragging in vivid detail about how he had finally grown a spine and thrown me out of my own house. He laughed as he described my supposed shock and helplessness, a narrative so completely divorced from reality that it perfectly encapsulated his pathological delusion. He painted himself as a conquering hero claiming his kingdom. This recording, David and I agreed, would be the perfect, devastating opening statement for our meeting. On the morning of the confrontation, I awoke in my hotel suite feeling a serenity I hadn't experienced in years. The storm was finally about to break. My plan, born from pain but executed with logic, was flawless. I had used the very skills that defined my professional life: patience, meticulous research, and a deep understanding of structural weaknesses to reclaim my personal life. I was not seeking to ruin my son. I was seeking to introduce him, for the first time, to the most fundamental and inescapable law of the universe, the law of cause and effect. The reviravolta wasn't coming. It was already here. They simply hadn't felt the ground begin to shake beneath their feet. Matteo and Sophia arrived at the pristine glass and steel tower of David's law firm with an air of defiant confidence. They were dressed for a victory, not a surrender. Matteo in a tailored suit I had paid for, Sophia in a designer dress and carrying a handbag that cost more than a month's mortgage. They walked into the lobby not as people summoned for a legal matter, but as victors coming to survey the terms of their opponent's capitulation. In their minds, this meeting was a mere formality, a desperate final plea from a foolish old man that they would graciously and firmly reject. Their arrogance was a tangible force, a shield they believed would protect them from any consequence. They were about to discover how fragile that shield truly was. I was already seated in the boardroom when they were shown in, positioned beside David at the head of the vast mahogany table. My presence was the first crack in their composure. They expected to deal only with a lawyer. Confronting me, the father they had discarded, was not part of their plan. I offered no greeting, my expression calm and unreadable. David, ever the professional, gestured coolly to the chairs opposite us. "Mr. Vargas, Mrs. Vargas, please have a seat," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. The title was formal, impersonal, instantly reframing our relationship from one of family to one of opposing parties in a legal dispute. The chasm between us was no longer just the polished wood of the table. It was a deep, unbridgeable legal and emotional gulf. Without wasting a moment on small talk, David began, his voice crisp and official. "Let the record show," he stated, nodding to the court stenographer in the corner, "that this meeting has been called to address a matter of property law. On behalf of my client, the Vargas Legacy Trust, I am formally serving you with this legally binding order of immediate eviction for the illegal occupation of the property located at 125 Elm Street." With a deliberate, smooth motion, he slid 2 copies of the official court-stamped document across the table. I watched their faces as they read the words. First came a flicker of confusion, quickly replaced by scoffing disbelief. The legal language was an alien concept to them. They couldn't yet comprehend its power. Matteo was the first to break the stunned silence, letting out a short, incredulous laugh. "An eviction notice? Are you insane? This is a pathetic joke," he spat, his voice dripping with condescension. "That is my father's house. It is my house by right. You can't evict me from my own home." Sophia, recovering her composure, chimed in with a threat of her own. "We'll sue you for harassment. We'll sue this entire firm into the ground. My father-in-law is clearly not in his right mind, and you are taking advantage of him." They were still playing by the old rules. A game of emotional manipulation and familial entitlement, utterly oblivious to the fact that the game had changed. And they were now on a legal chessboard where they were hopelessly outmatched. In response to their outburst, David didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply picked up a small remote control from the table and aimed it at the large screen that dominated the far wall. The screen flickered to life, and the cavernous boardroom was filled with the crystal-clear sound of my son's voice. They saw themselves just over a week ago in our living room. They saw Mateo's face contorted with rage as he screamed the words, "This house should already be mine. To me, you're already dead." The camera angle from the smoke detector was high and unforgiving, capturing the scene like a divine judgment. They then watched in horrified silence the footage of Mateo physically shoving me, his 72-year-old father, out of my own front door. The video didn't stop. It transitioned seamlessly into a montage of their victory celebration in the days that followed. They were forced to watch themselves dancing in the living room, toasting with my finest scotch. They heard their own voices, amplified by the conference room's sound system, mocking my senile paranoia and laughing about how I had probably run off to a retirement home. Each word of disrespect, each moment of cruel celebration they had enjoyed in private, was now laid bare for them to witness under the cold, fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The blood drained from Mateo's face, while Sophia stared at the screen, her mouth slightly agape, a mask of pure horror replacing her earlier smugness. The final video clip was the most damning. It was the recording of the real estate agent's visit. They watched themselves play-act the role of sophisticated homeowners, hearing their own greedy words about a quick sale and their plans for a new life in Spain. David paused the footage on a perfect tight shot of Sophia, who, after laughing, said to the agent, "The first step is getting rid of all the old man's junk, of course. That will free up a lot of space." The Sophia on the screen was smiling, triumphant. The Sophia in the room looked as though she was about to be physically ill. The public exposure of her private, callous greed was a humiliation more profound than any she had ever imagined. As they sat in a catatonic silence, the screen went black. David then gently pushed the second, much thicker, leather-bound dossier towards Mateo. "While the eviction is a matter for the trust," he said calmly, "this is a personal financial matter. This dossier contains a fully documented accounting of every dollar my client, Mr. Arturo Vargas, has loaned to you over the last decade. The outstanding balance, calculated with a modest 4% annual interest, comes to $857,432. The trust, as the new manager of Mr. Vargas's assets, is now formally calling in this debt in its entirety." Mateo's trembling hands opened the cover to see page after page of his own financial history, a meticulous record of his failures and my misplaced generosity. David let the weight of that number settle in the room for a long moment before he continued, his voice now as hard and sharp as a diamond. "This brings us to your options," he said, folding his hands on the table. "Option A. The trust will immediately file a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office citing felony elder abuse, illegal eviction, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. We will also, simultaneously, file a civil suit for the full debt. Our evidence is, as you have seen, irrefutable. You will both face significant prison time, followed by financial ruin." He paused, letting the word prison hang in the air between us. "A cold and terrifying specter," or David said, his tone unchanging. "You can avoid criminal prosecution by accepting option B. My client has drafted what he is calling a personal restructuring plan. Its terms are strict, absolute and entirely non-negotiable." He slid a final, single sheet of paper across the table. The terms were brutally simple. 1. Vacate the trust's property within 24 hours, taking only personal clothing and effects. 2. The debt of $857,432 is legally acknowledged, and a wage garnishment agreement will be put in place. 3. They are both formally and irrevocably disinherited from the estate of Arturo Vargas. This was the moment their world, the one they had taken for granted, officially ceased to exist. The immediate aftermath was not rage, but a complete and total collapse. The arrogance and defiance vanished, instantly replaced by a raw, primal panic. Sophia's gaze darted from the paper to Matteo, her eyes wide with terror. In that moment, she was no longer looking at her co-conspirator in a brilliant heist. She was looking at the bumbling accomplice who had led them straight into a jail cell. Matteo, for his part, was ashen-faced and speechless. The intricate web of denial and entitlement he had spun around himself for decades had just been incinerated by the harsh, inescapable light of reality. He was a man, watching his own life fall from a great height, powerless to stop its inevitable impact. They left David's office in a silent, zombie-like daze. The 24-hour deadline was a ticking time bomb. I can only imagine the scene at the house, the frantic, undignified scramble to pack. The rooms they had dreamed of renovating and redecorating were now just hostile spaces they had to flee. Every object they touched, the clothes, the electronics, the decorative trinkets they'd bought with my money, would have served as a bitter reminder of their monumental miscalculation. The act of stuffing their lives into cardboard boxes under the weight of their catastrophic failure was the first real consequence they had ever been forced to endure. In her desperation, Sophia began a flurry of phone calls. She reached out to the coterie of wealthy, superficial friends with whom she often had lunch. She tried to spin a tragic tale of a cruel, senile father-in-law being manipulated by a predatory lawyer. But the ground had been prepared. My quiet words of disappointment had already sown seeds of doubt. Her friends offered vague expressions of sympathy, but no concrete help. No one offered them a spare room or a helping hand. The social ladder they were so desperate to climb had been kicked out from under them, and they were discovering that their friends had no interest in catching them. Matteo, in a parallel act of desperation, made a call to my younger brother, his uncle Robert. He tried to paint me as a monster, a vindictive old man who had suddenly turned on his only son. But Robert, a practical man who had witnessed Matteo's lifelong pattern of irresponsibility, was having none of it. "Let me get this straight," I can hear him saying, his voice laced with incredulity. "You physically threw your own father, my brother, out of the house he built? You brought this on yourself, Matteo. Don't you dare call this family for help." The last safety net, the one of blood and shared history, had been decisively cut. They were truly on their own. The following morning, as they hauled the last of their boxes onto the driveway, a new humiliation arrived. The gleaming BMW and SUV, their proudest status symbols, were their intended escape vehicles. But a large tow truck pulled up to the curb. A man with a clipboard approached them and politely informed them that as the vehicles were registered as assets of the Vargas Legacy Trust, he was here to repossess them. In front of all the neighbors they had tried so hard to impress, the cars were unceremoniously hooked up and hauled away, a very public and undeniable symbol of their spectacular fall from grace. Without transportation and with their bank accounts frozen, they had to pool their remaining cash to rent a small, battered moving van. The contrast was almost poetic. They drove away from the stately, custom-built home they had tried to steal and unloaded their possessions into a sterile 10x 10-foot storage unit in a bleak industrial park. The grand furniture, the expensive electronics, the symbols of their stolen luxury, were all crammed into a dark, windowless metal box. Their entire world had been reduced to the contents of a single, dismal locker. This was the tangible, physical manifestation of their greed's reward. It was there, in the desolate, windswept parking lot of the storage facility, that Sophia finally broke. The foundation of her entire life, the money, the status, the illusion of impending wealth, had been obliterated in less than 48 hours. The affection she had feigned for Matteo evaporated, replaced by a torrent of pure, unadulterated venom. "You idiot!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the empty lot. "You were supposed to handle him. You were supposed to be smart. You're nothing but a pathetic failure, and you've dragged me down with you." The parasitic bond, forged in shared avarice, could not survive the absence of a host to feed on. That tirade was the death rattle of their marriage. Sophia made one last phone call, not to a friend, but to her parents in another state. Weeping crocodile tears, she painted herself as the innocent victim of the Vargas family's implosion. They believed her, or perhaps they simply felt obligated, and wired her the money for a one-way plane ticket. That evening, without so much as a goodbye to the man she had promised to spend her life with, Sophia took a taxi to the airport, her most valuable designer handbags clutched in her hands. Mateo was left standing alone in the parking lot, abandoned and utterly defeated. Mateo's new reality was a brutal descent into a world he never knew existed. His only option was a grimy, weekly-rate motel on the forgotten edge of town, a place that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by custom furniture and original art, the room with its sagging mattress and flickering fluorescent light was a circle of hell. The crushing reality of his situation began to sink in with every lonely, silent night. He had no home, no money, no wife, no status, and no family to call. He had lost everything he had ever pretended to value. With the trust's legal claim on his future earnings, securing a respectable job was impossible. His reputation was now toxic. Desperate for money to simply eat, he was forced to sign up with a day labor agency. The man who had sneered at blue-collar workers his entire life now found himself among them. I pictured him, in clothes bought from a second-hand store, his soft hands blistering as he lifted heavy loads on a construction site or cleaned debris from a demolition project. For the first time, he was experiencing the exhaustion of honest physical work and the meager pay that came with it. The story of the arrogant son who threw his father out only to lose everything became a piece of local gossip. A cautionary tale told over cocktails at the country club he could no longer enter. The social world he had been so desperate to conquer now viewed him with a mixture of pity and contempt. On the rare occasion he might encounter a former acquaintance on the street. They would either offer a quick, uncomfortable nod and hurry away, or stare right through him as if he were a ghost. The admiration he had craved his entire life had been permanently replaced by a brand of scorn reserved for the uniquely foolish. It is in the crucible of absolute solitude that a man is forced to meet himself. Alone in that dilapidated motel room, with the television buzzing and his body aching from a type of labor he never imagined, there were no more distractions. There was no Sophia to flatter his ego, no father to blame for his shortcomings. There was only the tired 42-year-old stranger staring back at him from the cracked bathroom mirror. The systematic demolition of his external world had finally forced him to confront the barren wasteland of his own character, a confrontation he had spent his entire life successfully avoiding. In that profound and painful isolation, he would have started to understand the true nature of his loss. It wasn't the house, the cars, or the money. It was the quiet, unwavering, unconditional love of a father that he had treated with such callous contempt. Faint memories, long buried beneath layers of resentment and entitlement, would have started to surface. Me teaching him how to tie his shoes. Mateo's new existence was a monotonous cycle of hardship, a world away from the effortless privilege he had always known. His home was a single room in a rundown motel where the faded floral wallpaper seemed to weep with the sorrows of 1,000 transient lives. His days began before dawn, waiting by the curb for the temp agency van, and ended long after sunset with an exhaustion that seeped deep into his bones. The work was grueling and anonymous, hauling drywall on a high-rise construction site one day, digging trenches for a plumbing company the next. This was not a temporary punishment designed to teach him a lesson. It was the stark, unvarnished reality of a life lived without a safety net. He quickly learned that there were no shortcuts back to his old world. Every desperate attempt to find an easier path was met with a closed door. He tried calling distant relatives and old acquaintances, but his name was now synonymous with disgrace. and his calls went unanswered. He applied for office jobs, but his patchy resume and the legally mandated wage garnishment made him an undesirable candidate. For the very first time in his 42 years, Mateo was forced to confront the world on its own terms, without the powerful lubricant of my name and my money. He was discovering day by painful day that the world owed him absolutely nothing. The first significant change was not a choice, but a necessity: humility. In the stratified world of a construction crew, arrogance was a liability. He was the new guy, the old man, the one with soft hands and no practical skills. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to take orders from a foreman half his age without a hint of his former condescension, and to accept criticism as a tool for learning, not as a personal insult. Surrounded by men who worked harder than he had ever imagined for a fraction of what he used to waste, he began the slow, humbling process of understanding that he was not, and had never been, special. This internal stripping away of pride was mirrored by a stark physical transformation. The soft paunch he had developed from years of fine dining and inactivity melted away, replaced by the lean, hard muscle of physical labor. His hands, once manicured, became rough and calloused, a testament to his daily toil. His face grew thinner, tanned, and weathered by the elements. It was as if the harshness of his new reality was physically chiseling away the soft, entitled shell he had worn his entire life, slowly revealing the form of a man he had never been. A crucial, non-negotiable component of the personal restructuring plan he had accepted to avoid prosecution was his mandatory attendance at weekly therapy sessions. He went to the first few meetings with a sullen, resentful attitude, viewing the therapist as just another agent of my control, another box to be checked in his humiliation. He sat with his arms crossed, deflecting her questions with sarcasm and blame. In his mind, he was still the victim, a son wronged by a cruel father, a husband abandoned by a faithless wife. The therapist, a seasoned professional named Dr. Alpert, who had been carefully selected by David's firm, was immune to his manipulations. She did not offer sympathy or coddle his bruised ego. Instead, she met his deflections with a relentless, surgical precision. She challenged his self-serving narrative at every turn, forcing him to examine his own words, his own choices. Her sessions were not a comfortable space for him to vent. They were a grueling cross-examination of the lies and delusions upon which he had built his entire identity. And he had nowhere to hide from her incisive questions. The breakthrough, as I later learned from Dr. Alpert's monthly reports, came during their 10th session. She had been pressing him to recount, in minute detail, the events of the day he expelled me from my home. Frustrated, he launched into his usual tirade about my stubbornness and his justified anger. But she stopped him. "Don't tell me how you felt, Mateo," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Tell me what you did. Tell me what he did." Forced to narrate the events objectively, to describe his own screaming, the act of throwing the suitcase, the sight of his father being shoved out the door, the reality of his own cruelty struck him with the force of a physical blow. The narcissistic armor he had worn for a lifetime finally cracked. From that single crack, the first tentative shoots of empathy began to emerge. In the lonely silence of his motel room, he found himself replaying that day, not from his perspective, but from mine. For the first time, he tried to imagine the experience of a 72-year-old man who had given his son everything, being physically cast out of the home he had built with his own hands. He pictured my face, not with the anger he had imagined, but with the quiet, profound disappointment he had refused to see. The weight of that realization was a new kind of burden, heavier than any bag of cement he had been forced to carry. With this new perspective, he began to reevaluate the intricate plan I had set in motion. He started to see past the humiliation and the financial ruin and recognize the cold, dispassionate logic behind it. It was not the chaotic, emotional lashing out of a wounded man seeking revenge. It was the work of an engineer, He saw the careful planning, the precise execution, the understanding of stress points and structural weaknesses. He came to the terrifying and enlightening conclusion that I had not set out to destroy him. I had set out to force him to build something for himself, on his own for the very first time. The true moment of clarity, the epiphany that cemented his transformation, occurred on a muddy, chaotic construction site. He was part of a team pouring the concrete foundation for a new community center. As he watched the massive pylons of steel rebar being lowered into the earth, he was struck by the sheer importance of what he was doing. He understood that no grand structure could ever be built, no walls could ever rise without this solid, unglamorous, and absolutely essential foundation. And in that moment, he saw his own life with perfect, devastating clarity. He had spent 42 years trying to build a skyscraper on sand. I had never been his obstacle. I had been his foundation, and in his greed and arrogance, he had tried to dynamite it. This profound realization fundamentally shifted his motivations. The desire to reclaim his old life, the house, the money, the status, vanished completely. He now saw that life for what it was, a hollow, gilded cage built on a lie. The man who had lived that life was a pathetic fraud, and he felt a growing revulsion for that version of himself. He didn't want it back. The resentment that had fueled him for so long finally burned itself out, leaving not emptiness, but a clean, quiet space where something new could potentially be built. His new ambition was not to reclaim an empire, but to lay a single, solid brick. He started to approach his work not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. He arrived early, he stayed late, and he listened intently to the experienced tradesmen around him. He began to feel a nascent sense of pride in a perfectly finished concrete pour or a precisely leveled frame. He was discovering the simple, profound dignity that comes from a day of honest, productive labor and the satisfaction of earning his own small place in the world. His shift in attitude did not go unnoticed. The site foreman, a gruff but fair man named Carlos, saw the change. He saw the sullen, resentful rich kid he had initially hired transform into a punctual, hard-working, and surprisingly inquisitive laborer. One afternoon, Carlos approached him. "Vargas," he said, "you're a hard worker. We've got an opening in our carpentry apprenticeship program. It's a pay cut at first, but it's a real future. You interested?" For the first time since his expulsion, Mateo was being offered an opportunity not because of who his father was, but because of who he was becoming. He accepted without hesitation. Learning a skilled trade at the age of 43 was a deeply humbling experience. His classmates in the apprenticeship program were mostly young men in their early 20s who learned quickly and regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. There were days of frustration where every cut was crooked and every nail bent. But he persevered, driven by his newfound desire to create rather than consume. He discovered a quiet joy in the smell of fresh-cut lumber and the deep satisfaction of turning a pile of raw materials into something strong, useful and true. The 40% wage garnishment continued, deducted automatically from his modest apprentice paycheck. But his feelings about it had changed. It was no longer a punitive tax on his existence. He now viewed it as a form of restitution, a tangible way of repaying a debt that was not just financial, but moral. He learned to live on the remaining 60%, to budget, to cook simple meals, to distinguish between a want and a need. He was finally learning the basic financial literacy that my wealth had always allowed him to ignore. Throughout this period, I maintained my distance. However, I was not uninformed. I received concise monthly reports from Dr. Alpert and from the trust administrator who managed his garnishment. I read about his struggles and his small victories with a detached but undeniable sense of guarded hope. I had set the stage for this transformation, but I knew that the real work, the heavy lifting of rebuilding a man's soul, could only be done by him. There was no contact between us, no words of encouragement. This was his mountain to climb alone, A small anecdote in one of the administrator's reports signaled a true turning point. Matteo had used his developing carpentry skills to spend a weekend building a wheelchair ramp for an elderly neighbor in his apartment complex, a woman he barely knew. He had refused any payment, doing the work simply because he saw a need and he had the ability to help. This selfless act, done without any expectation of praise or reward, was a powerful indicator that his character was genuinely being rebuilt from the inside out. He eventually saved enough money to move out of the motel and into a small, clean one-bedroom apartment in a modest but safe neighborhood. The furniture was second-hand. The art on the walls was from a thrift store, but it was all his, earned with his own 2 hands. I pictured him there, finding a quiet contentment in a life of simplicity that his former self would have scorned. The satisfaction of a solid day's work, the pleasure of a home-cooked meal, the quiet company of a book from the public library. He had traded luxury for dignity. One evening, a message appeared on his phone. It was from Sophia. She had evidently heard through some distant grapevine that he was doing better and floated the idea of meeting for a coffee to talk. It was a transparent, pathetic attempt to see if her host was viable again. The old Matteo might have been tempted by the ghost of his former life. The new Matteo read the message, recognized the toxic allure of the past for what it was, and deleted it without a second thought. He was no longer interested in rebuilding ruins. He was focused on his new construction. Through this arduous journey, Matteo finally learned the true definition of value. He had spent a lifetime believing that a man's worth was measured by the size of his house, the make of his car, and the balance in his bank account. He now understood that true value resides in character, in integrity, in the quiet respect you earn from your peers through your actions. He learned the hard truth that self-worth is not an inheritance to be claimed, but a structure to be built, one honest day, one solid deed at a time. His perception of me underwent its final, most profound transformation. The monstrous image of the cruel, vindictive father was gone, replaced by an understanding of me as a wise, if severe, architect of his salvation. He realized that my greatest act of love was not the endless stream of money I had provided, but the one decisive act of taking it all away. I had not given him what he wanted. I had given him, in the harshest way imaginable, what he needed, a chance to become a man. He was no longer just a man suffering the consequences of his past. He was a man actively and painfully engaged in the process of his own redemption. The change was not miraculous or sudden. It was a slow, grinding, day-by-day evolution. It was a transformation forged not by my words, but by the unforgiving reality I had forced him to inhabit, a reality where he had only 2 choices: build a new self, or be crushed under the weight of the old one. After nearly 2 years of weekly sessions, he and Dr. Alpert came to a mutual decision. His therapy was complete. He had confronted his past. He had accepted full responsibility for his actions, and he possessed a clear, humble, and realistic vision for his future. He was no longer a man defined by his bottomless pit of resentments, but by a quiet, steady determination to live a life of simple, honest purpose. And so, the man who had been so completely dismantled was slowly being rebuilt. The process was far from over, but the foundation was now, for the very first time in his life, solid. It was a foundation made not of my money or my name, but of his own hard work, his own humility, and his own dawning self-respect. The demolition had been a success, not because it had destroyed him, but because it had cleared the way for him to finally begin to build. 5 years have passed since that fateful day in David's office, the day the foundations of my son's world were systematically and deliberately demolished. 5 years is a long time. It's enough time for wounds to scar over, for new structures to be built, and for the quiet, relentless force of consequence to complete its work. The storm of those events has long since passed, and in its wake, a new and unexpected landscape has emerged for both of us, one defined not by what was lost, but by what was painstakingly and painfully rebuilt. I sold the large family home a few months after the eviction. To continue living there would have been like residing in a beautiful yet heartbreaking museum of a life that no longer existed. The sale was a final, necessary act of closing a chapter. With a portion of the proceeds, I purchased a modern, spacious penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline I had helped to shape. It is a place of light, glass, and open sky, with a large terrace where I cultivate a small garden. My life now is one of peaceful routine, quiet reflection, and a sense of purpose that is entirely my own, untethered to the expectations or actions of anyone else. The bulk of my estate, the wealth I had spent a lifetime accumulating, was put to a new and far more meaningful purpose. I established the Vargas Engineering Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing full scholarships and mentorship to gifted, low-income students aspiring to become civil engineers. My true legacy, I decided, would not be a collection of assets left to a single, undeserving heir. It would be an investment in a future generation of builders, dreamers, and planners. It is in their potential, in the bridges and buildings they will one day create, that the Vargas name will now find its real and lasting value. From the periodic and now final reports from the trust administrator, I have a clear picture of Mateo's life. He's 47 years old now, a fully qualified journeyman carpenter with a reputation for meticulous, honest work. He still lives in the same small, modest apartment, his life a testament to quiet discipline. Through the steady 40% garnishment from his wages over these past 5 years, he has paid back a significant portion of his financial debt to the trust. He has never missed a payment. He leads a solitary but not a lonely existence, a life of dignity he has earned, not inherited. As for Sophia, her story is a predictable and brief footnote. She never contacted Mateo again. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that she had moved back to her hometown, and within a year had married another wealthy, older man. Her life, it seems, continues its pattern of parasitic attachment, her character fundamentally unchanged by the ordeal. She was a creature of opportunity who, upon finding her host had been rendered barren, simply moved on to find another. Her fate is not a tragedy, merely an affirmation that some people will always choose the easy path, forever incapable of building anything of their own. Then, about a month ago, a letter arrived. It was the first direct communication I had received from my son in over 5 years. The envelope was plain, the address written in a steady, unfamiliar hand. For a moment I hesitated to open it, unsure what I would find inside. Was it a plea for a truce? A request for money? A final, bitter accusation? With a deep breath, I slit the envelope open, my heart steeled for anything. But what I found inside was none of those things. The letter was short, written on a single sheet of simple, lined paper. "Father," it began, "I'm writing this letter not to ask you for anything. There is nothing you could give me that you have not already given. 5 years ago, you gave me the unvarnished consequences I had earned, and in doing so, you gave me the one thing I desperately needed, a chance to build a life, my own life, from scratch. I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you, and for the profound disrespect I showed to Mother's memory. I work every day to become a man she would not be ashamed of. Thank you, Father. Thank you for being the engineer who knew that the old, rotten structure had to be demolished before anything new could be built." I read the letter twice, standing on my terrace with the sprawling city below, a city built on the principles of sound foundations. I felt no surge of triumph, no sense of victorious vindication. Instead, a quiet, bittersweet feeling of closure washed over me. The letter was not an apology designed to win something back. It was a simple, powerful acknowledgement of the truth. It was the final, irrefutable proof that my cold, calculated, and painful strategy had worked. It had not only preserved my own dignity, but it had, against all odds, saved my son from the prison of his own character. It is important for you to understand that this was not a fairy tale ending. There was no tearful reunion, no grand reconciliation. The bond of trust between a father and son, once so profoundly shattered, cannot be perfectly pieced back together. We will never again be the family we once were, sharing stories in the grand living room of the house on Elm Street. That house and the relationship that existed within it are gone forever. Our resolution is not one of renewed intimacy, but of a shared, separate peace. The deep wound has finally become a scar, a permanent reminder of the damage done, but one that no longer aches. Through this long and arduous journey, I have come to understand the fundamental difference between justice and vengeance. Vengeance is a hot, blinding fire. It seeks to inflict pain for pain's sake, and it ultimately consumes the one who wields it. Justice, on the other hand, is a cool, clear force. Its purpose is not to punish, but to restore balance. My plan was never to make Mateo suffer indefinitely. It was to make him responsible, to force him to feel the true weight of his own choices. The consequences I engineered were not a cage, but a harsh and unforgiving classroom, and he was finally ready to learn. In the end, this story is about the true meaning of a legacy. For years, I mistakenly believed that a father's legacy was the wealth and comfort he leaves for his children. But that legacy of ease created a monster of entitlement in my son. I see now that the greatest legacy a man can leave is not what he builds for his family, but what he builds within them. It was only when I was forced to implement a legacy of radical accountability that I gave my son the tools to build his own character, a structure far more valuable than any house or fortune. My legacy now thrives in the bright, ambitious young minds that the Vargas Foundation empowers, and it lives in a much quieter but no less meaningful way, in the steady hands of a middle-aged carpenter who understands the profound dignity of building something true. He didn't get the inheritance he so desperately craved, but he ended up with something far more precious, a life he can call his own. And for a father, that is a resolution more satisfying than I could have ever hoped for. If you enjoyed this story, please support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. To hear the next story, click on the box that appears on your screen. Thank you for watching.